So I am speaking to Bernard Picton, marine biologist, who has spent his career diving around Northern Ireland since the early 1980s.
I learned to dive when I was at university in Bristol. So my earliest diving was on the south coast of England, southwest coast of England, and Pembrokeshire in Wales. And yeah, that would have been in about 1970, I think. A long time ago.
Very good. Whereabouts in the southwest?
Well, my very first dive was actually at Durdle Door. I noticed some people got injured jumping off Durdle Door just very recently. Broke some bones or something. But yeah, and the first dive I did, I remember seeing some kelp when it sort of wafted against the front of my mask, because the visibility was probably about 3 inches. I don't know why it didn't put me off. It would have to be Rathlin Island, I guess, yeah, or mostly anywhere around Rathlin, but particularly the archway at Rewcallan on the north side of Rathlin. Probably places on the east coast of Rathlin as well, which are very unusual.
Is there anywhere in particular on the east coast?
I could say Picton's Reef, couldn't I? Which was a reef that we found by accident. We were up there surveying the sponges, and we were just sort of flying along with the echo sounder running on the rib, and all of a sudden it jumped up from deep water into relatively shallow water. And so we said, oh, we'll better go back and have a look at that. And it was in an area where we hadn't looked. And there is, when you now look at the charts, they've now got very detailed, side scan sonar and so on. And you can actually see it is quite a specific piece of rock, but there was nothing marked on the old Admiralty chart there. So yeah, and having a reef named after you was rather nice. I suppose I've had two big periods when I've dived with the Ulster Museum. And one was back in the 1980s when we did all the original survey work all around the Northern Ireland coast. I should say I started about, I came to Northern Ireland in 1975. So my first season's diving would have been 1976. And we did work in Strangford Lough, Dundrum Bay, and then the Skerries up near Portrush, and then more in Strangford Lough. And then we got this big contract for about 3 years, which employed 2 more divers to do the whole of the Northern Ireland coast. And then that was really funded mostly by whatever the Environment Agency was called at the time, which was probably Countryside and Wildlife Branch, I think. And that was when, yeah, we got a boat and we got a compressor. Well, no, we had the compressor. And we really got stuck in with developing methods for surveying for biodiversity and trained each other up and took lots of photographs. Then really, I didn't get more work to do with the museum until about 2005, when I managed to get more money. And that time it was mostly from EU, actually, the EU Building Sustainable Prosperity Fund. And that then let us dive Rathlin Island, but looking specifically for sponges. And then all the other diving I did was mostly weekends with Queen's University and that sort of thing.
And these earlier dives, these were in sites that presumably hadn't really been explored before.
Well, that's what we were trying to do, was make a baseline survey. So yes, it was, at that time, nobody had dived most of the sites. I suppose there were a few sites that got dived regularly, but most of the coastline wouldn't have been dived at all before we looked.
Yeah. And the interest in sponges, where did that come from?
Oh, that started quite early too, because when we were doing the surveys during the 1980s, we sort of split up. There was myself, Christine House and David Connor, and we sort of split up which groups we would concentrate on. Now actually, I think it was Christine did the sponges. I'm trying to remember which groups I did. Hydroids and cnidarians probably. Dave Connor liked some of them. Oh, I would have done mollusks as well. Some of the mobile things, and Dave did a lot with the crustaceans, which I just ignored, and the sea squirts as well. He did a good job with the sea squirts. So we divided it up a bit, but we were all just learning from each other and learning from the books and taking photographs and trying to find out what things were, and then also creating a voucher collection for the museum. Everything that the books were terrible at the time, so it was really hard to identify anything at all. So you had to bring a specimen back and look at it under the microscope. We used to say that one day's diving was probably about 2 weeks' work just to figure out what the things were that you'd seen.
And presumably, I mean, you were finding species that you didn't know existed in Northern Ireland.
Oh, yeah. That we just didn't know existed, I think. Yeah, that's right. It was, as I say, we were just learning and teaching each other. It was lucky at that time. I mean, we did have underwater cameras, but it was always filmed, so you only had 36 shots on a dive. So you would photograph 36 things that mostly you didn't know what they were. And then once we got back and got the films processed, which took about a fortnight, we'd have several days then just sitting, going through the photographs in a group, and somebody would say, "Oh, look at that! I wonder what that is," and we'd have the specimens too, and be able to put them under the microscope and check in the literature, and gradually build up that knowledge of what there was there from scratch, really. So we started building the sponge collection at that stage. And then also when I was at the museum, probably just after that survey finished, I'd realized already that sponges were one of the most difficult things to identify. And so I used to go over to the Natural History Museum in London for about a week each summer and just go through the collections there, trying to identify things that we were finding in Northern Ireland by comparing microscope slides. And then again, at the same time, the predecessor to Sea Search, really, which was Marine Conservation Society, were trying to make identification guides to all of these different groups. And one of them was for sponges. So I was part of that project, trying to write identification guide for sponges. And yeah, it just gradually built up from there. But still, there are so many that we don't know anything about, or that we've only ever seen on a handful of occasions. That was when I was at university, because as soon as I learned to dive, well, within 2 or 3 years of learning to dive, I met Tom Thompson, who was probably the foremost expert in the world at the time. Now, I was actually a botanist when I was at university, so I didn't meet him through my lectures because he was in the zoology department. They were in the same building. And then just after I left, finished my degree, and I'd got keener and keener on the diving, but I got a temporary job working in the museum, which was right next door to the zoology department. So I'd be out looking, and Thompson at the time was writing the new book on the nudibranchs. There hadn't been a book since, what, 1850 or something. So he was revising that. So he and then his PhD student, Greg Brown, and myself were sort of all out looking for, and so Greg was often my buddy. And I actually sort of taught Tom Thompson to dive, because, I mean, he would have been a lot older than me, but he couldn't dive and I could, which was the critical thing. So, and yeah, we just became friendly, and then I started finding interesting things, and he was very encouraging. So yeah, that was partly what got me started on nudibranchs. Elizabeth Platts, who was a school teacher really in Belfast, she was quite friendly with the people at the museum. So I met her at some mollusk meeting, and she said, "Oh, you could come over and dive with the people at the museum." And so I think it would have been about 1974, probably about a year before I actually got the job in the museum. I came over and did a few dives with the people at the museum, and then went to the West Coast. And when we went to Donegal, the weather was just appalling. It just blew about a force 8 from the west. So we didn't actually get in the water, but we did spend quite a bit of time in the pub. So I got to know these people a bit. And then something like 6 months or 9 months later, one of the guys who was the dive technician at the museum left for another job. He went to Canada. And so that job became vacant. So that was, I think that was just what led me into the job at the museum here.
And amazing now, because you organise trips over here, and you get experts coming from around the world to explore nudibranchs off places like Rathlin, as well as many other species groups.
Northern Ireland coast is very, very unusual because we have that strong currents running through the North Channel, and that makes for very rich biodiversity. And really, if you start looking at the map of the world, it has to be like right world class, in my opinion. Yeah, and Rathlin's also sort of stuck in that flow of water going in and out. And places that have strong water flow, the animals living on the seabed get lots and lots of food brought to them in the water. So it's extremely good for all sorts of invertebrates. There have been so many, really. I mean, one of the nice things that we did going right back would have been probably around about, I think which year it would have been now. But David, I said it when I first came here, then we were diving quite often at Strangford Loch, and then we did the Skerries up near Portrush. David had actually struck up a relationship with a few people from, I think, the BBC, and there was a guy who wanted to make a bit of an underwater film. So he made a film with us in Strangford Loch, and I think trying to remember, I think it was 1978. Now, Stratford Lock to me is a muddy, dark, old hole. You know, it's quite difficult to work in. So I was quite keen to get somewhere with a bit clearer water, and that means the North Coast. And anyway, the film was quite a success. So that went out. And they planned then to do another one. I think it was the following year. So probably 79 or possibly 80. And they decided we would do this up at Portrush. And I said, oh, I know who I could get to come. And that would be Greg Brown, my buddy who did the nudibranch book with Tom Thompson. So we managed to get Greg to come. And nobody had looked at what was on the coast there. I guess the divers had been out looking for pieces of silver on the wrecks like the Girona, but nobody had really looked at the animals. And what we did find then were, in particular, I'm thinking probably a thing called Thecacera penigera, which is a nudibranch that's mostly southern. We didn't expect to find it anything like as far north. And there were quite a lot of finds on that trip that we were really surprised about. And they would have then all made it into the new nudibranch book, which came out, I think, in 1984. And Greg Brown did all the paintings for that book. So that book isn't illustrated with photograph, it's illustrated with paintings. And it's quite, some of them are actually these ones that he and I then found on this Ulster Museum trip up to Portrush. So at the same time as making the film, we were trying to, you know, he was doing these original paintings that ended up in that book. So yeah, that would have been at least one of the most memorable trips ever, I think. But just recently, I'm trying to think, it might have even been the beginning of this year or the end of last year, we discovered that one of these nudibranchs was not one species, but 3 species. And Greg had actually, I think that specimen actually came from the Isle of Man rather than from Northern Ireland. But Greg did the paintings, and in the painting, you can see he's illustrated 3 different like color variations. And now we've got the DNA, which showed that those 3 color variations were 3 species. So I contacted him very recently and said, is it all right if we use that parts of that plate in the book? So we did. That plate is, and he's actually still got the original paintings. Now, he never had a career as a biologist. He actually had a career in sort of like pipeline surveying for the North, in the North Sea for the oil industry, I think. But it is nice that that sort of, you know, that continuity is still there, like 40 odd years later. Oh, I think it would be fantastic because it just answers all the questions that you need to plan a dive. You can find out where people have been already, and you can find out a bit about how to get there, how to launch your boat, where to launch your boat, all the details that you need to plan something. And usually that sort of planning takes either local knowledge or it takes you a long time to gather that information together. But the other thing I think that it's got potential for is to focus people not just on going to the same site again and again, which is often a wreck actually, but getting them to explore more and to explore in terms of looking for what some of the animals are. And I think it's got fantastic potential, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how people react to it and make use of it. Yeah.